Hi, I'm Christopher Ray, and welcome to the third of 3 video lectures about Wang Anyi's novel, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow. I also suggest that you check out the brief video lecture that I made about Wang Anyi's life and works. In this video lecture, I'll focus on part 3 of this 3-part novel, in which we say goodbye to our heroine, Wang Xiao. And I want to argue that The Song of Everlasting Sorrow is both a vehicle for and a critique of living in the past. And I use the term au revoir, because au revoir means until we meet again. And Wang Xiao is a figure that is repeated so many times in so many different ways that she comes across as something of a historical trope. One whom, even though this particular Wang Xiao has died, we may see coming back again and again. The Song of Everlasting Sorrow is often talked about as being a work of nostalgia. And so I want to talk a little bit about the 1990s moment in which you have a lot of economic development, you have urban renewal, but you also have the tearing down of buildings and the decline of a former way of life. So we'll talk a little bit about the history that gave rise to this type of nostalgia, but I also want to focus on the literary side, about the repetitions, the recreations, the shadows and refrains that we get in this work to suggest the return of the past. I'll then focus a little bit more closely on Wang Xiao herself, who I think is presented as a vehicle of historical experience and memory, or more broadly as the way that human beings interact with the past. Wang Xiao is associated with particular motifs like mirrors. She is clearly a foil to the personality of other characters, and she's also a screen onto which other characters project their own desires. We talked about sound in the previous video lecture, but I also want to focus on vision, because one of the last images that we get of Wang Xiao involves déjà-vu, which is a particular type of historical consciousness, one that is experienced by an individual. The critic Wang Ban, who is not related to Wang Anyi, once commented that Wang Anyi injects meaning and hope into the past. The past persists to re-enchant life that is increasingly hollow and empty. And I think in the case of The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, this observation is quite apt. In this novel, Wang Anyi includes some architectural icons of an old modernity, such as the Park Hotel. This is still standing in Shanghai today, this Art Deco edifice. This is the site of a date between Wang Xiao and director Li. Alice Apartments, where Wang Xiao lives much of her life, is located in the Jing'an Temple district, very close to the Paramount Ballroom, referred to as the Paramount nightclub in the novel. This too is still standing today. What is vanishing from Shanghai's cityscape is the Longtang alleyways and neighborhoods that were invoked in that very first section of the novel. These are increasingly a thing of the past. The raising of shikumen dwellings and Longtang alleyways to make way for new high-rises is part of the so-called urban renewal of Shanghai, and it is indeed destroying a way of life. But this is old news. This has been going on with increasing rapidity since the 1990s. And the scope is vast. Hundreds of thousands of people are being evicted from dwellings so that these low-rise structures can be torn down. One of the very ambivalence-inducing spectacles that has been simultaneous with all of this destruction of actual neighborhoods is the recreation through new constructions or through the refurbishment of selected places, is these new tourist-oriented, including domestic tourist-oriented, sites like Xintiandi in Shanghai, where you can go to and have a Starbucks coffee or just sit around, lounge around, take some photographs of the beautiful architecture and savor the feeling of a recreated old Shanghai. This is partly a Shanghai story, but it is also a nationwide story. This trend has turned China into Chinar, like where to demolish next. The imperative of progress has resulted in many modern conveniences, to be sure, but it has also left many people with a profound sense of loss. So the 1990s was really the moment when you had this very strong trend to represent and recreate and reimagine and have this archaeological project to dig out old Shanghai and represent it through literature. This is a trend that continues today. Since the 1980s and especially since the 1990s, people in urban China especially have been in what you could call a new age in search of old colors. And The Song of Everlasting Sorrow is a novel that comments on this ongoing culture of urban nostalgia, one that was really wrought by this age of prosperous destruction. In the novel, figures like Wang Xiao and Mr. Cheng, her friend, are discussed as remnants of the past, but presentable remnants, even though the feeling that they have is that they are living someone else's life. So this is a profound out-of-body experience. When you have an out-of-body experience, you are essentially experiencing repetition. And I would just note back to that previous video lecture that The Song of Everlasting Sorrow is a repetition of tragic romance and regret, and that we have these 2 earlier stories about courtesans and emperors of old that have converged in Bai Jui or Bo Jui's famous narrative poem. And then we have many more iterations, even within the pages of this one novel. For example, in Wu Bridge, where we have the moon of a bygone Shanghai shining on Wang Qiao. And this makes Deuce think of the Bo Ju poem. The most obvious symbol of this nostalgic trend is Lao Ke La. And actually, there are two types of Lao Ke La. One is from the 1950s and 1960s, who we don't see too much of. The main one that we focus on is the one that emerged in the 80s. So there's several generations of nostalgia. It's not like there's just one old Shanghai and one new Shanghai that's nostalgic for the past. So we were working, in other words, in an iterative mode. Iterative just means the act of repeating, or an iteration is a repetition. And in storytelling, iteration is conveyed through structure and motif, as well as other techniques. So one of the effects of repetition in, say, narrative fiction is to emphasize a theme or to intensify emotion instead of, say, develop the plot. Here are just a few of the repetitions that occur in Wang Qiao's life. She has a friendship with a younger person who is fashion conscious. That happens a couple of times. She has a personal relationship that goes from intimacy to estrangement to loss several times. We have the popularity of a particular type of clothes or music or food or other consumption item that comes back again and again. And of course, we have multiple love triangles. Wang Qiao herself is presented as a type of fashion, like a clothing that has gone out of style but is now back in style. Wang Qiao bonds with one member of the new generation over this type of recycling of the old to make it new, even though her daughter is not so sympathetic. Zhang Yonghong is once described as changing boyfriends faster than most people change light bulbs. And I think we have something of a gendered inversion of that old saying that friends are like limbs, while wives are like clothing. So I want to argue that Wang Qiao doesn't just have split selves, she also has multiple functions. And that she's defined, and she helps define other types of meanings in the story through contrast with other personalities, through psychological projection, that a lot of people project their own desires onto her, through the settings that she inhabits and the spaces that she interacts with. She's very much associated with these cozy, even claustrophobic spaces. And of course, things do close in on her at the end. But then there's also an allegorical dimension of, for example, Wang Qiao representing some aspect of Shanghai, a city that had a heyday and then has a decline. And will it have a resurgence? This is not an exhaustive list, but you could see how Wang Qiao's situation and her personality contrast a lot with the other people in her life. Mr. Cheng is a nice guy, but he's very timid and self-effacing. Jiang Lili, in contrast, is very reckless and romantic and comes to grief. Sasha is quite juvenile, and he's very rootless, right? He's very much out of place himself, whereas Wang Qiao does inhabit a place. She does have a habitus. Kang Mingxun is very weak and ingratiating. Wei Wei is somewhat indifferent and vulgar. Xiaolin is very ambitious. And then, of course, we have this grasping swindler, Longlegs, who appears at the end, and is described as a man without a memory. Again and again, we're told that other characters project their own desires onto Wang Qiao. This is just one brief example of the Deuce character. Deuce is just a fleeting person in her life. Kang Mingxun endures a little bit longer, but even he has his own desires, his own fantasies, which he projects onto Wang Qiao. And those desires are often very distinctly gendered, that she's both a mother to these two men, Kang Mingxun and Sasha, as well as a lover to them both. Both of them seem to have mother issues. In part one, the narrator draws a distinction between the beauty queen and the first runner-up, who are both idols, representing our ideals and beliefs. But in this third place is connected to our everyday lives. She is a figure that reminds us of concepts like marriage, life, and family. But I would argue that this everyday lifeness can also be a projection. It can also become iconic. And I think that is very much the case in this novel. Take, for example, Wang Qiao's profession. She is a nurse. She's not a doctor. She's not an elevated member of the medical community, but she ministers to a local community. She does help people who are immediately around her. Her impact is local. It is not citywide, and it is certainly not national or global. Her clientele is anonymous or semi-anonymous. Her labor is very, very repetitive. It involves a lot of waiting, so there's a lot of leisure time in her life. She has a lot of me time, you could say. And then she's also somewhat passive or reactive, so patients come to her. She's not out finding new patients. Wang Qiao's profession is kind of a quotidian, everyday, career-oriented repetition. But there's also another type of psychological and emotional repetition through déjà-vu. This is a very prominent motif in Song of Everlasting Sorrow, and of course, it is what ends the novel. Wang Qiao often has this feeling that she has experienced something before, or she's seen it before, and this becomes a premonition. So in part one, with that actress lying on the bed in the film studio, we have the first of several doppelgangers, right? A ghostly double or counterpart of a living person. And cinema, of course, is a type of phantasmagoria. It is a projection of fantasies, even if the reality of the studio might be quite tawdry and run down. I would also argue that we could see copies of Wang Qia being presented directly through particular characters like her daughter or her daughter's associates. We also have copies that are like photographs, or the film actress I just mentioned. But there is also a symbolic structure to this work that involves reflections, visions, shadows, phantoms, and mirrors. And by the time we get to part 3, Wang Qiao is increasingly viewing her own life through the prism of others' lives. Now she is only an observer. She is feeling like she has seen this before in her own life, and now she is seeing it in someone else's life. Her return to Alice Apartments is another good example. She had returned to Alice, but Alice was now a different Alice, and she was a different Wang Qiao. This feeling of repetition in déjà vu becomes increasingly unpleasant. Or preparing for her daughter's marriage, she is watching Wei Wei being made up for her wedding photographs, and she feels like she had ended up an onlooker at a spectacle that she didn't want to see. Karl Marx has a saying about history, and you can read the original here for yourself. It's one that's often paraphrased as, history repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. And I think in the case of Wang Qiao's life, there's a little bit of applicability in that we have many, many repetitions, but the ultimate repetition at the end, the ultimate déjà vu, is very, very negative one. It is one that is cheap, dirty, avoidable, something of the product of a vulgar age. If Wang Qiao makes her own history, she does not have complete control over it, and the age does impose itself upon her in the most brutal way possible. Before her final end, Wang Qiao reflects on the vulgarity of Wei Wei's generation. All the elegance of old Shanghai seems to have been wiped out by a violent storm. And so we do have this uncanny feeling that it has come back, but it has turned into something else. Wang Anyi ends her novel not with a meaning, but with a gesture. Not with a song, but with a cinematic image. This is the déjà vu vision of our dying heroine as she lies there and realizes she's seen this movie before.